what we know about trafficked organs is that it usually doesn't result in the death of the that's the difference. Every organ is used. The hair is used. The fat is used. The skin cells are used for collagen beauty products, which British women put on their faces every night. I mean, this is something that the BBC discovers every 3 years. You can set your watch by it. But, and then they ignore the organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience issue. So I do feel like there's a fairly big distinction. Honestly, and it's a terrible thing to say, but, if I were an Indian farmer in a poor village and I had a bright young son or daughter who was going to go to university, I'd sell a kidney. Might lower my chances of living for a year or two, but I consider that it is a form of human exploitation, but not like this. This is a step further. And let me explain why I say that. If I get back to so this is sort of an interesting picture, and it doesn't. I like this picture very much, and if you look at it, it's an execution ground. We don't know exactly where. We think it's in Xinjiang, China. Look at the expressions. I don't know if you can see it that clearly, but if you look at the expressions of the faces, you've got one who's sort of reserved, he's holding himself back, and he's trying to look official. You've got another one who's trying to pretend it's all a big joke. Actually, I think he's probably a Uyghur, based on the mustache. And the one in the front is looking at us defiantly, because he's the one who just did the shooting. You see that rag on his arm? That's to prevent his uniform from getting stained from the back splatter as he fires the gun into the heads of the people that he shot. And you can see the people that have been shot there. And the reason we have this picture at all is because this is not, in China, this is an acceptable picture. These people did something. There's big character posters explaining exactly what crime they're capable of, or what crime they did. So this was a legal procedure for many years. And in fact, to this day, if China became a democracy suddenly, I have no idea whether or not they'd repeal the death penalty or they'd keep it. There are cultural differences. But I think the significance of this form of organ harvesting is this. These are the new executioners. In other words, this is not really a money-based. And the backbone of this whole thing is that it came from the Communist Party's desire to control populations, not to make money. I mean, making the money is in China, these things often get mixed up like they do anywhere. But money is really the corruption that kind of the sort of gasoline that keeps the engine going. But the original creation of that engine was from the state. Now these are increasingly, for the last 20 years, really since 1997, these have become potential executioners, and now they really are the ones who do it. These people are done while they're alive, and so forth. We'll get into that. I just want to introduce the books very quickly. You already have a couple of them. So Bloody Harvest, of course, is David Matus and David Kilgore, and laid down the foundation of this entire thing. It's the seminal work. It covered an amazing amount of ground, particularly given the time they did the investigation in, which it still astounds me. State Organs is an interesting book that kind of shows a building coalition about this issue, and has doctors from all over the world talking about how they relate to this issue. The Slaughter's my book. That's 2014. It's on Amazon. You can get the download very quickly if you go for the e-edition, and I get more money. The update is, David mentioned it. It basically showed one thing with its 2,300 footnotes and so forth, which mostly were Chinese sources, about 90% of them. What it showed was that, it's not 10,000 transplants per year. That's a Chinese claim. It's just kind of an offhand figure. It's 60,000 or to 100,000 easily. Phenomenal. That's a phenomenal figure, and it means the Chinese are by far number one in the world in this industry. Now, I also want to dispute a little bit one thing you said, which is about the mainstream media. Now, the fact is, the mainstream media has covered this issue. It's been in the New York Times 6 times over the last year and a half. People just don't look at the articles. They don't click on them, okay? That's the truth. It's been in the Globe and Mail. It was in CNN. Our report was directly reported on in CNN and Times of London, Independent, Guardian, Telegraph. People don't click on this stuff. There's not a lot of concern about it, and this is the truth. And in fact, the resolution that we'd fought so hard for, and particularly Torsten Trey of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, passed. This resolution passed in Congress in 2016. It passed in 2 weeks later in the European Parliament. They passed almost exactly the same resolution. Now, the Council didn't pick it up, but nonetheless, the statement was made. Now, in fact, the country that's held back a bit, through no fault of Ben Rogers here, because he's one of the authors of this report, The Darkest Moment, which was the Tory report, and did make organ harvesting a big part of its analysis of human rights abuses in China. But the Foreign Office has been really refuses to move on this issue, and actually refuses to cooperate with the European Parliament and with, strangely enough, with the Congressional Executive Commission on China in the U.S. on this. I don't know why. It's a big mystery. But the bigger mystery was what happened in China, and this map is just to give you, that's a map taken from my book, and it's really just relevant sites and locations out of my book. If you were to actually cover all the places where organ harvesting takes place and all the prisons and hospitals and so forth, you'd have a black mass over the entire East Coast. But we can sort of, if we look to the northwest there, in that desert region up there, that's Urumqi. This is the home of the Uyghurs. The home is Xinjiang, which is Uyghurs call East Turkestan. And it's at the Air Force Hospital that our story begins, and Enver will talk about that.
The Urumqi Central Railway Hospital, this is where I used to work.
Yeah, I know. Okay, sorry. Okay, so that's right. Actually, the Air Force Hospital is where the first organ from a political prisoner that we know of was sold in 1997. So in other words, there was an uprising. Enver will do his own story. But there was an uprising, a small uprising in a place called Gulja in 1997. And it was followed by a big crackdown. And in that crackdown, several things happened, but basically people were taken away. And young Uyghur men disappeared, and then one nurse, in fact, became convinced that this one guy was going to be harvested for his organs. He was a political prisoner. Huge distinction. He's a man who's committed no crimes. He's put his arm, Allah Akbar, something like that. That's his crime. Okay, we'll get to that. But let's go back again to before that happens. We had an established system of execution in China. Again, another picture that's come out of China. This is not considered a shocking picture. This woman killed her husband while he was sleeping. It's often used by dissidents to sort of show the brutality of China, but in fact, in China, this was kind of a popular picture. It showed justice. Now, the important thing here, though, is that they started using these organs of prisoners, and that's how the industry began. This man, I interviewed him. He described coming up to a corpse after execution and finding that every body part had been taken out. Right? He kept screaming, "Empty, empty!" The corpse was empty. Okay, so this man, in 1994, something distinctive happens again in that area in Xinjiang, which is he is a Uyghur guard who worked with the Public Security Bureau, the Gestapo or whatever of China, and he describes screams coming out of the organ harvesting vans that were at the mobile execution sites, as if people were still alive when they were going in. That's the distinction. Enver's right here. He'll talk about the next part of that in 1995. Gulja is 1997. That's where you have this mild uprising, which is followed by, this was a policeman who talks about how suddenly they started patrolling the cemeteries. Okay, so young men were disappearing, and suddenly the cemeteries were completely off limits. The reason why was because the bodies were essentially being stripped before they went to the graves. At the same time, you have a comprehensive blood testing for the first time of political prisoners in particular. And this is done on behalf of 6 high-ranking Chinese cadres who arrive in Urumqi looking for organs. They get their organs eventually, and I talked to the doctor who did the testing of the prisoners. That's not him in the picture. I don't want to reveal his identity. And he did the testing, and they got their organs, and then 6 more arrived. So that was the beginning of the cycle of taking innocent people and killing them for their organs. But it was kept very quiet, and the whole Xinjiang region is very separated from China, and so it was easy to control that. And I don't see any sign that it started to become policy for the rest of the country. And we have kind of a missing link at that point between Enver, who can talk about this with direct experience, and other doctors. And here is one. In 2004, this doctor, his name is Dr. ITNJ. Some of you may know him as the mayor of Taipei. So he was a surgeon. He went to China. He was looking into organs for his clinic. And everybody knew you go to China. That's a very short waiting list, about 2 weeks. Get an organ anywhere else, you wait 2 years. So he goes and he looks into prices. And he was told, well, we will give you all, the foreigner price, essentially. And he bargained. He said, I want the Chinese price. I'm your cousin. They got to know each other, and he finally expressed, he said, look, I'm not even sure that these organs are any good. They're coming from drug addicts. They're coming from hardened criminals. These people, they drink, they smoke, they're a real problem. They finally said, well, look, you don't understand. All these organs are coming from Falun Gong. Okay. These people, they don't drink, they don't smoke, they practice this very healthy form of Qigong, and, all your patients are going to be healthy like them. So don't worry. And he actually, this became a big issue in his election, and may become an issue when he becomes prime minister of Taiwan as well, president of Taiwan. At any rate, let's move to Falun Gong itself. How did that happen? The big question I usually get, and we often get, is why? Why the persecution? And I would argue that there are different reasons at different times. I mean, initially it starts very much partially because of this man Jiang Zemin, partially because the group was just too large, considered to be too big, partially because the Public Security Bureau had muscles that were kind of atrophying and needed to be flexed. All these reasons are there, but I think the biggest reason is right in here. The fact is, this is starting in the real heart of northern China, Shenyang, Beijing, Tianjin, Changchun. And it was also spreading. It didn't have any limits. It was urban. It was rural. It seemed to go into the intelligentsia very, very quickly. So you had peasants who couldn't even read, combined with top university professors. And it went here. And yes, but they really feared is that little boy there. Okay? When the Chinese Communist Party was looking at that little boy wearing the army uniform, and who was growing up to be a guy like this, who was performing the exercises openly, military guys. And this woman, now she was a very nice old woman who taught the exercises, the Falun Gong exercises, but she taught them to some unusual groups. China Central Television, the Public Security Bureau of China, the top leadership, the wives of the top leaders. She taught them all the exercises. And she's a very normal woman, sort of doing extraordinary things. But this threatened, this woman is what scared the Chinese Communist Party. This was like a fire which had spread throughout the entire system. And to a Marxist, this was the Marxist method of seizure of power, right there, in front of their eyes. Especially to see that linking up to the top leadership. So the repression begins, and that was, some of the people who worked on that repression were perfectly nice guys too. Like this one ran a labor camp. And he actually set it up. He said, I'm like a Schindler. I tried very hard to make sure that the Falun Gong women that I was looking after would be taken care of and I would protect them. But this woman starved to death under his watch. Her throat was damaged through forced feeding. This is a fact. Some Schindler. The other cause of you could say Falun Gong did not give up. It was an unusual group that way. It did not fade away. This guy led the first successful hijacking of television signals in Chinese history. an entire city, Changchun, was taken over for 1 hour. All the television signals. And it was an amazing story. And these are other pictures that the Chinese put out of the other part of the gang. So this was, Falun Gong in its heyday. In fact, we saw something in the film briefly of that same, that's in Dalian. That's in Dalian, and people are gathering for morning exercises. But these people went here to Shenyang Prison City. That's Shenyang Prison City under construction. This is what it looks like today. It's enormous. We've never really seen structures like this. There's no penal systems like this anywhere in the world. This is a much smaller prison, Guangdong prison, but what's interesting is if you look at that red area there, that was where the buses would pull in every 6 months to gather Falun Gong practitioners to be taken away for organ harvesting. These are the hospitals that, 2 of the major hospitals in Shenyang, which actually organ harvested them. And I'll just go through this very briefly. This is this was probably the top policeman in China. He was the right-hand man of a man named Bo Xilai, who was a contender for the presidency of China. That's him running the operations. He had his own center, a chop shop for we believe Falun Gong, Uyghurs, and so forth. And there's a complicated story surrounding that, showing how this was really the turning point where the Chinese began to get worried that there was too much exposure. Now, just say a word about numbers. If you leave that guy in the middle out of the picture, you've got a very good representation of Falun Gong refugees. These all 5 women had been in labor camp. All 5 women had been tortured. One of them, I'm not saying which one, was sexually abused very severely. And the one on the left was given blood tests that were clearly for organ tissue matching. They were looking at her very closely for her organs. Out of that, I pull a number, 65,000. It's a much more complicated procedure than that, but it's really a wartime estimate. We don't really have a firm grasp on the numbers. That was 65,000 for 2000, 2008. They have, for Gourmetis is 41,500 between 2001 to 2005. We all find it very hard to make good calculations on how many people are actually dead, though I do believe it is in the hundreds of thousands at this point. Going back to the map for a second, the last group I just mentioned about, although House Christians and specifically Eastern Lightning have been harvested, or at least looked at for harvesting for their organs, is the Tibetans. The Tibetans, now the thing that held the Tibetans back, the reason they didn't harvest them initially was they simply did not have, look at that infrastructure. There was nothing there. They didn't even have a close-by hospital. But eventually, now they built them, okay? And it came in as soon as Bombardier made that train deal to have that super fast train. That sat on my desk in Beijing for months, that stupid deal. That's when they started shipping out Tibetan organs. David mentioned this very well, so I don't really have to go into it. He mentioned, it's so odd, the relationship we have with these people. He's in that first film. This is Delmonico, Francis Delmonico, the head of the TTS. In some ways, he's our frenemy. He's our frenemy. He basically has made a deal with the Chinese that he won't say anything impolite about prisoners of conscience, and in exchange, they'll reform. That's his deal. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable deal in many parts of the world. But what I do resent about this fellow and these fellows in general is that they act like they know something about China. They do not. China is a very difficult country. Human rights is actually a field which I think takes some expertise. I don't even think I'm an expert in it. But there are some. But they don't listen to those people. They don't listen to the China experts. It's just like some naive businessmen coming in and getting fleeced in China, and it happens every day. And this time, it happens that he's not losing money for his company, he's losing lives in the world. So this is really an appalling thing, and I'm happy to take question on it. Having said that, and there's also so much hypocrisy there. This hospital there, while they were making this kind of deal and saying nice things about China, this Tianjin Hospital was advertising on the web in English to say, come to China, get your organs. Okay? That was happening. It was happening all the way into 2014. It stopped about 6 months before my book came out. This is completely against Chinese law. In 2007, they passed a law saying absolutely no foreigners can come to China for organs. You know, what are we making you do here? This is that's Tianjin Hospital. It does 5,000 transplants a year. 5,000. It's the biggest hospital in the world for transplants. And you know, China's claiming it's only doing 10,000 transplants a year in the whole country. This is the Vatican. This is a Vatican meeting a year ago, and they invited the Chinese. They came under a lot of flack. Again, the press did step in. The New York Times ran an article saying this is very controversial that the Chinese are there. So again, there has been some mainstream approach. It just hasn't sort of caught the popular imagination. There has been some mainstream coverage of this. I'll skip through the numbers very quickly. You can just get an idea. This is enormous. I think there's one final thing that I see as the ultimate hypocrisy. This is a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and he's dying in his bed because the Chinese let him die. I mean, there's no way they gave him proper treatment, and they did this in front of the entire world. And yet, we're supposed to believe anything from the Chinese medical establishment. This woman, 2013, it never stopped. She was given an organs-only examination along with 500 other Falun Gong practitioners in a single day. And now the final chapter. Even if one believes that, and there is some evidence that Falun Gong persecution is tailing off a bit, okay, that they're, at least on the local level, the people are more relaxed and the PSB isn't really going after them at the same rate. It started over again in Xinjiang. So the Uyghurs, who up till now really weren't big targets of organ harvesting, what I'm going to describe to you next is science fiction. We have 17 million Uyghurs. That's every man, woman, and child who's Uyghur in Xinjiang has been now tested, blood tested, and DNA tested. That happened in the last year. And we've just now learned about it. Now, then, only 2 weeks ago, the Congressional Executive Commission on China came out with a report saying that 500,000 to 1 million Uyghurs are now detained. They're incarcerated in re-education camps. These are very high numbers. This was the same number we had with Falun Gong that I estimated, 500,000 to 1 million at any given time. Now, those numbers aren't perfect. I'm sure there's a bit of a revolving door. Sentences can range from 1 weekend to 20 years. But we are going to start seeing the same sorts of things coming out of this. We're seeing torture, even new methods of torture. And so I really don't know what to say about that except that one thing. I live here, actually. I mean, I'm a British citizen as well as an American citizen. And I am somewhat ashamed in my country in my new country for not grappling with this problem properly, for not, at least, don't run with the Vatican. At least run with your allies. Run with America. Run with the European Union. I mean, this is. So I think that's the very least that could be done, is to make at least go through the measure of condemning this procedure. And that's where I want.
We are the power behind the ITNJ. Add your voice. Sign the treaty.